At 34 years old, Naomi Calder stood in the mud of a courthouse yard in Willow Bend, Missouri, with everything she owned tied into a single canvas bundle. Her husband's own brother, Silas Calder, had signed the papers that put her off the land she had farmed for 12 years, telling the county clerk that a widow held no claim once a note came due, law being law, and grief being no excuse for debt. She had $11 folded into the toe of her boot, a name nobody in 3 counties would hire, and a red hound named Copper pressed hard against her skirts, the only loyalty left to her in the whole world. So when the auctioneer's voice cracked out over the crowd, calling the old Whitlock Millhouse, boarded shut, sunk in 9 years of weeds, whispered about by children daring each other to run past it after dark, Naomi did the one foolish, desperate thing left to a woman with nothing to lose. She raised her hand and bought it for a single silver dollar. She did not know yet that beneath its broken millstone lay a secret sealed away by a good man's hands, a secret that would not only save her, but would restore an entire town to what it had once been, and set right a wrong that had been quietly rotting Willow Bend for the better part of a decade. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Calder and her faithful dog Copper. If stories of quiet women who rebuild what others left broken speak to something in you, tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and we will read every one. Naomi had not always been a woman who understood ruin. She had been born Naomi Ashford, in the rolling limestone country of central Kentucky, the only daughter of a miller named Josiah Ashford, a broad, quiet man, whose hands were permanently pale with flour dust, and whose voice never rose above the hum of his own millstones. Their mill had stood on Coldwater Creek since before Naomi could remember, and as a girl she had spent more hours among the grain bins and the grinding floor than she ever had at her mother's hearth. Her mother, a gentle, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, had died of a lung fever when Naomi was 9, and after that, it had been Naomi and her father and the mill, the 3 of them turning together like the great wheel itself. Josiah taught her things a miller's daughter had no business knowing, or so the town gossips liked to say. He taught her to read the color and heft of grain, to know wheat from chaff by the sound it made falling through her fingers, to set a stone so it kissed rather than crushed, to keep an honest ledger down to the last half peck, because a miller who cheated his neighbors, Josiah said, was worse than a thief in the night, since a thief at least had the decency to be ashamed of himself. Honesty, he told her more than once, patting the worn ledger book that never left his coat pocket, was the only currency that never inflated and never failed. Naomi carried those words the way other girls carried locket photographs, close and warm against her chest. She was 19 when Thomas Calder came through Kentucky, driving a small herd of cattle west, a broad-shouldered young man, with an easy laugh and calloused hands, and something in the steadiness of him reminded her of her father. They married within the year, and when Thomas spoke of land waiting to be claimed along a good river in southern Missouri, Naomi did not hesitate. She said goodbye to Coldwater Creek, to the mill that had raised her as much as any parent, and rode west beside her new husband, with her father's ledger book wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom of her trunk. They settled in Willow Bend, a modest river town ringed by oak and sycamore, and built a cabin on 40 acres of good bottomland that Thomas worked with a stubborn, cheerful patience Naomi came to love more with each passing season. It was hard country, and harder work, but it was theirs, and for a time that was enough. Copper came to her, in the spring of their 4th year in Willow Bend, a scrawny red pup, from a litter born to a neighbor's blue-tick hound, after a difficult whelping that left the mother too weak to nurse them all. Naomi had sat up 3 nights running with a scrap of flannel and a dropper of warmed milk, coaxing the smallest, sorriest pup of the litter back from the edge of dying, and by the 4th morning, when his eyes had cleared and his small body had finally stopped its terrible shivering, he had looked up at her with an expression so plainly grateful that she felt something in her chest crack open and refill all at once. She named him Copper, for the color of his coat, which caught the firelight like a new penny, and from that day forward, he did not leave her side by more than the length of a rope. He slept across her threshold. He walked the fence line beside her every morning before the sun was fully up. He learned, without ever being taught in any formal sense, to read the small changes in her voice and her shoulders, the way her father had once read the color of grain, and when Thomas would come in from the fields, and find them together, the woman singing low over her mending, and the dog dozing with his chin on her boot, he liked to say that he had married one soul, and gotten two for the price. It was, Naomi would later think, the last truly easy season of her life, though she did not know to treasure it as such, while she still had it. Evenings that first summer often found the two of them out along the fence line at dusk, Naomi walking the boundary of the land Thomas had cleared with her father's ledger habit still alive in her, counting fence posts and noting repairs in a small notebook of her own, while Copper ranged ahead of her through the tall grass, flushing quail, and startling himself half out of his skin at the sudden thunder of their wings, before trotting proudly back to her side, as though he had personally driven off some great danger. She kept bees that year, 3 hives set along the tree line, and Copper learned early, and painfully, to give them a wide berth, though he never lost his habit of sitting a respectful distance away to watch her work the frames, his head tilted with an attention so total that Thomas used to joke the dog understood more of the honey trade than most grown men in the county. It was a small, unremarkable happiness, the kind built from 100 ordinary evenings rather than any single grand occasion, and it was precisely that ordinary, accumulated warmth that made the years to come feel so unbearably empty by comparison. The fall came slow, the way most ruin does, disguised at first as ordinary misfortune. It began on a gray October morning, when Thomas and 2 other men from Willow Bend went out to float a raft of cut timber down to the sawmill at the county seat, a job he had taken on to earn the hard cash they needed to clear a debt on a new plow and a pair of mules. The river was running high and mean after a week of rain, and somewhere below the bend at Miller's Rock, the raft broke apart against a snag, and Thomas Calder did not come home. They found him 2 days later, a mile downstream, tangled in driftwood, and Naomi buried him on a hillside above the cabin they had built together, with Copper lying pressed against her skirts through the whole of the service, so still, and so silent, that more than one neighbor woman remarked afterward that the dog seemed to understand loss better than most people did. Grief alone might have been survivable. What was not survivable was what came after. Thomas, it turned out, had co-signed a note with his older brother Silas 2 years prior, borrowing against both their names to purchase a threshing machine they had meant to share between their properties, and when Thomas died, Silas came forward not with comfort but with paper. The note, he explained, standing stiff and unsmiling in Naomi's own kitchen, with his hat still on his head, had come due, and a widow with no income and no male kin to vouch for her could not be expected to carry a debt of that size. He had, he said, already spoken with Elias Pruitt at the bank about it, and Pruitt had been, in Silas's words, more than reasonable. Naomi did not fully understand until the sheriff's man arrived with the foreclosure papers 3 weeks later, that reasonable, in this case, meant that Silas had signed over his own claim to the land entirely to satisfy the debt, keeping himself clear, and leaving Naomi with nothing, not even the courtesy of a warning delivered to her own face, rather than left with a stranger at her door. The town watched it happen, the way towns often watch such things, with sympathetic murmurs, and lowered eyes, and not one hand raised to stop it, because Elias Pruitt held the note on nearly every farm along the river, and a town that owed a man money did not often find the courage to cross him on behalf of someone else's grief. Naomi had gone to Pruitt herself, in those first raw weeks, asking only for a season's grace to bring in the harvest already standing in the fields, a harvest that would easily have covered a fair portion of the debt if only she were given time to gather it. He had received her in his fine office above the bank, with every appearance of sympathy, had even pressed a clean handkerchief into her hand, when her composure briefly failed her, and had then explained, with the patient regret of a man delivering unwelcome but unavoidable news, that a note was a note, and that Silas, as the surviving co-signer, had already made his wishes on the matter plain. She left that office with nothing but the handkerchief, and it was only much later, looking back with the clarity that comes from finally understanding a man's true character, that she recognized the visit for what it had been, not an appeal she had lost, but a performance she had never had any real chance of winning. So it was that Naomi Calder found herself, on a raw spring morning some 4 months after burying her husband, standing in the courthouse yard with her canvas bundle and her $11 and her dog, watching the last of what had been her life sold off in pieces to strangers, and telling herself, with a hard, thin kind of resolve, that she was not finished yet, whatever the town believed. The auctioneer that day was working through a short list of county forfeited properties nobody much wanted, parcels too poor or too strange to draw serious bidders. And the old Whitlock Millhouse was last on the list precisely because everyone in Willow Bend already knew its story, or believed they did. Ezra Whitlock had run the town's grist mill for the better part of 20 years, a solitary, exacting man who ground wheat and corn for every farm in the valley, and kept the whole community fed through 2 hard winters that Naomi had only heard about second-hand. Then, 9 years back, in the dry, terrible summer of the Great Drought, Ezra Whitlock had simply vanished. Some said he had gone mad from the heat and the ruin of his crops, and walked into the river. Some said he had run off owing money. The bank had claimed the mill for taxes not long after, and it had sat boarded and silent ever since, its wheel rotted, its millpond choked with cattails, its name spoken by children in the particular hushed, delighted tone reserved for places believed to be haunted. When the auctioneer called the property, the crowd actually laughed, a short, ugly ripple of amusement at the idea that anyone would want it. Naomi did not laugh. Something in her, some old instinct inherited from her father, some stubborn refusal to let a mill stand ruined, when a mill was the one thing in the world she actually knew how to run, put her hand up before her mind had fully caught up to her arm. $1, she said, and the auctioneer, startled into brevity, brought his hammer down before anyone could think better of it or bid against her. The crowd's laughter followed her out of the courthouse yard, but Naomi did not turn around. She walked the 2 miles to the Millhouse with Copper trotting at her heel and her canvas bundle over her shoulder, and when she finally stood before the sagging building with its broken wheel and its weed-choked pond, she felt, for the first time in months, something that was not quite hope but stood close enough to its shadow to be mistaken for it. The inside of the mill smelled of dust and old grain and river damp, and the first night Naomi spent there, she slept on a bed of clean straw she had gathered from the loft, with Copper curled tight against her back, the way he had every night since he was a pup too small to know his own name. It was near midnight when he woke her, not with a bark, but with a low, insistent whine, his body rigid, and his nose pressed to the seam of the grinding floor near the base of the great millstone. She sat up, more curious than alarmed, and watched him paw once, twice, at a board that seemed, in the lamplight, no different from any other board in that old warped floor. But Copper did not stop. He scratched and whined, and looked back at her, with an expression she had come to know well over 6 years together, the look that meant he had found something, and would not rest until she understood it too. Naomi told herself it was only a rat's den, or a loose board settling in the damp, and went back to sleep telling herself so, but in the morning, when she returned to the grinding floor with the daylight to help her, Copper was already there again, still scratching at the very same board. It took her the better part of that first week to work up the nerve and the tools to properly investigate what her dog seemed so certain of, days spent instead in the ordinary, exhausting business of making the old mill fit for a person to live in, sweeping out 9 years of dust, patching a hole in the roof with scrap tin, coaxing the ancient cook stove back into grudging service. But every single day, without fail, Copper returned to that same board on the grinding floor, and by the fifth morning, Naomi had begun to trust his instincts more than her own doubts. She pried the board up with the flat of an old crowbar she found hanging in the mill's tool shed, and beneath it, she found not a rat's den, but a second board, and beneath that, set so cleverly into the floor joists that it would have taken a deliberate search to ever notice it, a trap door with a small iron ring sunk flush into the wood. Her hands were shaking, she would admit later, by the time she got the trap door open, and Copper pushed his head past her knee to peer down into the dark space beneath the grinding floor before she could stop him, his tail wagging with an urgency that told her, more clearly than words could have, that whatever lay down there was not a thing to fear. She lit a lantern and lowered herself into a small stone-lined cellar, no larger than a root cellar, dry and cool, and carefully built, and there, arranged with the same precise careful hand her own father might have used, she found Ezra Whitlock's secret. It was not gold, though for one wild moment, her heart leapt at the sight of a locked strongbox in the corner. It was, instead, something stranger, and in its way more valuable. A row of ledger books, bound in oilcloth, their pages, filled with the same tight, careful hand, across nearly 2 decades. And beside them, a second, smaller stack of ledgers, that told a very different story from the first. Naomi carried them up into the lamplight, and spent that whole night reading. Copper stretched across her feet, as though standing guard over both her and the secret he had found, and by dawn she understood 2 things clearly. The first was that Ezra Whitlock had, during the drought years, secretly ground and given away grain to families across the valley who could not pay. Families whose children would otherwise have gone hungry through that terrible summer, doing it quietly, through a hidden chute built into the cellar wall that let him pass sacks out to the mill pond after dark, without anyone in town ever knowing who their benefactor truly was. He had kept a careful record of every family he had helped, not for credit, but, as one entry explained in his own careful hand, so that one day, if the town ever needed proof that it had survived its hardest year through more than luck alone, the truth would be there waiting. The second thing she understood, reading deeper into the smaller set of ledgers, was darker. These were records of the Willow Bend Grain Cooperative, a fund the farmers of the valley had paid into for years to guarantee seed and flour in hard seasons, a fund that Ezra Whitlock, as the town's miller, had helped administer alongside the man who kept its books at the bank, Elias Pruitt. And according to Ezra's careful hand, in the 2 years before his disappearance, the cooperative's reserves had been quietly and systematically drained, transferred out under Pruitt's signature into accounts and land purchases that had no business touching a fund meant to feed hungry children. Ezra had confronted him, the ledger noted in an entry dated only weeks before his disappearance, and Pruitt had made what the old miller called, with grim understatement, a very clear threat regarding what would happen to a man who tried to make trouble for the only bank in 3 counties. Naomi sat back against the cold stone wall of that hidden cellar as the sun came up outside, her father's old lessons about honest ledgers ringing in her ears, and understood with a cold, sinking certainty that Ezra Whitlock had not gone mad, and had not run off owing money. He had known too much, about too powerful a man, and he had vanished not long after saying so out loud. It took less than a week for word to reach Elias Pruitt that the widow Calder had taken up residence at the old Whitlock place, and had been seen carrying strange bundles of paper into town, asking careful quiet questions of the oldest residents about the drought summer 9 years back. Pruitt was a tall silver-templed man of considerable polish, the kind of man who greeted every soul in Willow Bend by name, and remembered the names of their children besides. And he came to the Millhouse himself on a bright afternoon, driving a fine trap, and wearing a smile that did not extend to his eyes. He admired the repairs she had made. He expressed, with practiced warmth, his sympathy for all she had suffered, and then he offered to buy the Millhouse back from her, on the spot, for $50, a sum so wildly out of proportion to the dollar she had paid, that Naomi understood immediately she must be sitting on something he wanted very badly indeed. She thanked him, and told him the mill was not for sale. His smile thinned considerably, before he climbed back into his trap and drove away, and Copper, who had stood the entire visit at rigid silent attention beside Naomi's skirts, did not stop watching the road long after the trap's dust had settled. The pressure that followed was slow and deniable, the particular kind of cruelty a powerful man could inflict without ever raising his voice or dirtying his own hands. The county assessor arrived unannounced to reassess the mill's taxes at a punishing new rate. A rumor began circulating, traceable to no one in particular, that the widow Calder had gone strange out at the old mill, talking to herself, digging in the dirt at all hours, following in poor mad Ezra Whitlock's very footsteps. 2 farmers who had agreed to bring her their corn to grind, eager for a closer mill than the one 3 towns over, quietly withdrew their custom after visits from men Naomi never saw but whose fingerprints she recognized well enough. One night, someone opened the sluice gate above the mill pond and let the water run out entirely. A piece of vandalism that would have crippled any working mill, though it did Naomi little practical harm, since her wheel had not yet turned in 9 years regardless. It was, she understood, a warning, not a wound, meant to remind her how easily a wound could follow. Through all of it Copper stayed close, sleeping now with one ear cocked toward the road, growling low and immediate at any unfamiliar wagon, and more than once Naomi found herself grateful beyond words for the simple, steady fact of him, the one creature in Willow Bend who had never once doubted her. There was one night in particular, close to a month into the pressure, when a pair of unfamiliar riders came slow and deliberate along the mill road well past midnight, only to be met by a wall of furious barking that carried clear across the mill pond, and brought Naomi to the window with her father's old shotgun already in her hands, before the riders had even drawn level with the gate. Copper did not stop, did not so much as pause for breath, until the 2 horses had wheeled and retreated the way they had come, and afterward, he stood a long while at the fence line, with his hackles still raised, refusing to settle back onto his straw, until Naomi herself had walked the full perimeter of the yard, and satisfied him that the danger had truly passed. She did not know, and never would know for certain, whether the men had come only to frighten her, or had meant something worse, but she understood well enough that a lesser dog, or a woman without one, might not have woken in time to matter. She might have given up, or at least given in, if not for 2 things. The first was her father's ledger, still wrapped in its oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk, a physical reminder of the man who had taught her that an honest reckoning was worth more than any comfortable silence. The second was an old woman named Sarah Pruitt, no relation to Elias despite the similarity of name, who lived alone at the edge of town, and who, when Naomi finally worked up the courage to knock on her door and ask about the drought summer, wept before she had gotten 3 sentences into her question. Sarah's own children had been fed through that terrible summer, she said, by sacks of flour that appeared mysteriously in her spring house every fortnight, with no note and no explanation, and she had always suspected, though never dared say aloud, that Ezra Whitlock was behind it, because who else in Willow Bend had ever had both the means and the quiet decency to do such a thing without asking for a word of thanks? She was not the only one, Naomi soon learned, once she began asking the same careful questions of other old families along the river. There were 7 households in all, who remembered unexplained flour and grain arriving through that hardest of summers, and every one of them, once shown Ezra's careful handwriting, recognized it and wept in turn. Naomi called the town meeting herself, a thing no widow of her standing had any real right to do, but she sent Copper's own steady presence along with her written notices, walking door to door through Willow Bend with the dog at her heel, and her father's honest bearing in her spine. And enough curiosity had built up around the strange doings at the old mill that nearly the whole town turned out at the schoolhouse on the appointed evening, Elias Pruitt among them, seated near the front with the same thin, watchful smile he had worn on her porch. Naomi stood before them with Ezra Whitlock's ledgers in her hands, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect it to be, and told them first of a miller, who had quietly fed the valley's hungriest children through the worst summer any of them could remember, asking nothing in return, not even his own good name. She watched 7 families in that room begin to weep as she read their names aloud from Ezra's own hand. And then, when the room had gone soft and grieving and ready to listen, she told them the second part, of a grain cooperative fund drained dry by the very man entrusted to guard it, of threats made against a good man who dared object, of a disappearance 9 years old, that had never once been properly investigated, because the man with the power to investigate it was the very man who had cause to want it forgotten. Elias Pruitt rose to his feet with practiced outrage, calling it slander, calling for the sheriff to remove the widow Calder from the schoolhouse. But the sheriff, an older man named Dobbs, who had known Ezra Whitlock personally, and had always privately doubted the story of a man simply walking into the river, asked instead to see the ledgers for himself, and asked Pruitt, in front of the whole gathered town, why the cooperative's own bank records, which Dobbs happened to know were kept at that very bank, could not simply be produced to settle the matter cleanly, if Pruitt's conscience was as clear as he claimed. Pruitt's composure did not survive that question. He blustered, then threatened, then, when Dobbs quietly noted that a man with nothing to hide generally did not threaten a sheriff in open meeting, he finally bolted for the door, only to find it blocked by half a dozen farmers, whose own foreclosure notices, it turned out, bore his signature, and whose ruin, they were only now beginning to understand, had lined the very pockets meant to feed their children in hard times. What followed in the weeks after was not the stuff of high drama, but of slow, deliberate justice, the kind Naomi's father would have recognized and approved of. A proper investigation, backed now by Sheriff Dobbs and a circuit judge summoned from the county seat, confirmed everything Ezra's ledgers had recorded, tracing years of quietly embezzled cooperative funds into land and cash that Pruitt could not adequately explain. He was arrested that same season, stripped of his position at the bank, and though the courts moved slower than any of Willow Bend would have liked, he ultimately faced trial and conviction for fraud, his fine silver-templed composure gone entirely by the time he was led from the courthouse in irons past a crowd that no longer offered him a single sympathetic murmur. As for what had truly become of Ezra Whitlock 9 years before, the truth surfaced only slowly and never entirely, though an old hired hand of Pruitt's, coming forward once his employer's power had finally broken, admitted enough to confirm what the town had by then already come to believe in its heart, that a good man had died for the crime of honesty, and had spent his last quiet years hiding proof of it beneath his own millstone, trusting that someone, someday, would have a dog patient enough and a heart honest enough to find it. The cooperative's remaining assets, along with a considerable portion of Pruitt's own seized holdings, were restored to the valley's farming families under new, transparent stewardship, and Naomi's own debt, the note Silas had signed away her land to satisfy, was among the very first accounts made right, the bank's new management ruling that a debt built on a corrupted institution's fraud held no honest claim on a grieving widow. Silas Calder himself, shamed thoroughly before the whole town he had once been so quick to defer to, came to the Millhouse one gray morning that autumn, hat in his hands, and offered, in a voice smaller than Naomi had ever heard from him, to help however she might need. She did not forgive him easily, and told him so plainly, but she accepted the offer of his labor, and over that winter, with his help and the help of half a dozen farmers, whose families Ezra Whitlock had once quietly fed, the old mill's wheel turned again for the first time in 9 years, grinding good Willow Bend wheat into good Willow Bend flour, this time under the honest, watchful stewardship of Naomi Calder, Miller's daughter, who had at last found her way back to the trade her father had raised her in, and had brought a whole town home with her in the process. The 7 families Ezra had once fed in secret were the first through her doors that opening week, each bringing a small sack of their own grain to grind, not because they especially needed to, but because they wanted, they said, to be part of the mill's first honest turning. And Sarah Pruitt herself stood at the edge of the mill pond that morning with tears on her face, watching the wheel catch the current and begin, at long last, to move. Naomi kept Ezra's ledgers on a shelf, just inside the mill door from then on. Not hidden this time, but displayed plainly where any farmer bringing in a wagon load of corn might see them. A quiet, standing reminder of what honesty had cost one good man, and what it had finally restored to an entire valley. Copper, for his part, took up a new post at the base of the very millstone, beneath which he had once scratched so patiently at a stubborn floorboard, and there he stayed most days, dozing in the flour-dusted light, while the great wheel turned above him, as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that his work in this particular story was finished, and finished well. It is worth remembering, we think, standing now at some distance from that muddy courthouse yard, where our story began, that Naomi Calder had nothing when she raised her hand and spent her last honest dollar on a building the whole town had already given up for lost. She had $11, a dog, and a lifetime of her father's lessons about honesty being the one currency that never fails, and she had no way of knowing, in that moment, that the mill she was buying out of sheer desperation held within it both her own salvation and a debt of justice 9 years overdue. It was Copper, in the end, scratching patiently at a floorboard no human eye had thought twice about, who found what a good man had hidden and a bad man had buried. And it is worth remembering too, that the truest kind of loyalty, the kind that dog gave that widow every single day of their life together, asks for nothing in return, and often sees what the rest of us, worn down by grief or fear or simple habit, have long since stopped looking for. Naomi Calder rebuilt more than a mill that winter. She rebuilt a town's faith that honesty, however long buried, does not stay buried forever, and that the smallest, most overlooked things, an old dollar millhouse, a scrawny pup too weak to nurse, a quiet man's careful ledger, can turn out to hold more worth than anyone standing in that courthouse yard could ever have imagined. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. And with Naomi and Copper, whose story we hope stays with you the way the good ones always do. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things, and overlooked people, are so often worth a second look. We leave you with this to sit with before you go. What is the one buried, overlooked thing in your own life that might be waiting, patiently, for you to finally dig it up? Until next time, stay close.